Hi, I'm John deSteiguer. I'm the president of Oklahoma Christian University. We've got two incredibly special guests that are with us. They're going to be presenting tonight to lots and lots of folks. We have Gabe Lyons. Gabe is the founder of Q Ideas. It's a group that frankly educates and mobilizes Christians to make a difference in society. How great is that? And David Kinnaman. David is the president of the Barna Group, one of the best research outfits across the nation, specializing in matters of spiritual nature. Gabe and David, so glad that you all are here.
It's great to be here.
And this is not your first time. You
No.
have been here individually several years ago. It's great to have you back as a duo today.
Thanks. We're bringing the band back.
Yes.
It's the Gabe and Dave band, I guess.
Well, you're going to have lots of sales here, whatever you sing tonight. I know that. Hey, so about a little over a decade ago, you all collaborated on your first book, Unchristian. It was a fascinating book, really, really great, good education for myself and many, many others. You all now have written a second book together, Good Faith. Being a Christian when society sees you as being extreme and irrelevant.
Yeah.
Seems to me that this is the time and that is the perfect book to speak to some of the really tougher issues generally we have in society, a very divided society. If you and I disagree, we can't have relationship. At least that's what some believe. Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, and essentially the title Good Faith is meant to say, look, faith is good. Faith is in Jesus is actually what leads us through some of these times and helps us understand how human beings were built to function, how we were meant to flourish, where that abundant life really comes from is in our faith in Jesus. But yet the subtitle you read sounds pretty negative, being a Christian when society thinks you're irrelevant and extreme, and sometimes we feel like we're the duo that's delivering bad news because 10 years ago it was a book called Unchristian, and it was laying out, really how 16 to 29-year-olds felt pretty negatively about faith, and that trend line has just continued. But in this book, we wanted to take research on pastors, on Christians, on understanding people who aren't even Christians in the culture at large, how they're feeling about this intersection of faith and public life. And there's a lot of tension, and we try to explain how a person of faith can enter this moment with a lot of hope and joy, but understanding a sober-mindedness that things have changed and that going back to the basics is actually the way forward. Progress doesn't look like just adding anything onto our faith. It's probably stripping some things away that we thought were important, but actually are getting in the way of the basics. And so this book helps describe how to understand the context, but then move forward and train up and disciple people to know what it looks like to engage a new culture.
I think sometimes we joke that we have the spiritual gift of discouragement. But because you think about the titles unchristian or living in a culture that thinks you're irrelevant and extreme. But for me, being a researcher, I'm always driven by what is true, what is reality. One of the great quotes is from this fellow by the name of Max Dupree, who says that the first job of a leader is to accurately describe reality. So as God calls us to be salt and light, as we're leading organizations or leading in our families or leading in our workplaces and our neighborhoods, we have to describe reality. We have to be honest about what's happening around us, and that's what drives me as a researcher, to try to tell the truth so that we can deal with that truth faithfully.
And as a researcher, David, are the numbers just overwhelming that this is the issue? I mean, once we divide over or disagree over topics, we tend to break relationship?
Yeah, I mean, this is the conversational nature of our country is really at an all-time low. We're having a hard time talking past our differences, and the research actually bore that out. A majority of Americans say that social media doesn't make us more social. They tell us that they'd have a difficult time having a normal and natural conversation with someone who is different from them. We actually went through and looked at all sorts of different groups, evangelicals, members of the LGBT community, atheists and agnostics, Mormons, and we went through and it was like every American, a majority of Americans believed that they would have a hard time talking with some of those smaller groups in America. And so we're sort of tribalizing. We're creating these little groups of us, whether we're part of the Churches of Christ, or whether we're part of a charismatic movement, or we're part of a Baptist church or whatever. There's a sense in which we're all really comfortable in our little bubbles, but we're having a harder time getting out into the world and interacting with others. And again, I think for me, I'm a lifelong pastor's kid, I think about the role of the church in mission. we should be the very best at conversations. I mean, that's the very nature of evangelism, is we should be out there having meaningful conversations, especially with people who are different from us. The gospel compels us to do that. And so that's part of the reason why we worked on this project together, was to try to equip the church to have really good conversations, effective conversations. Paul even writes that our conversations should be gracious and effective in Colossians 4. It should have the right answer for people. So that was part of our motivation, was to try to help give some tools for people in this very difficult conversational space today.
I was talking to a father the other day of a college student who is a Republican, and one of his best friends is a Democrat, and they've been best friends for 30 years. And they disagree about a lot of things, about how to get things done or what's the best policy approach, to solving problems as their political views might determine. But he's having an interesting conversation with his daughter, who's a college student, and in their conversation, she was explaining how she disagreed, politically with one of the students that was part of her dorm life. And they got into an argument, and now they weren't going to be friends anymore. And the father said to the daughter, are you kidding, honey? Like, you can get along and still be friends with somebody, even if you disagree ideologically on some things. And the daughter had no concept or framework for how that was possible, because all our college students are seeing in media, social media, and many times around just their friendships, is that the world that David's describing, these little tribes, are forming, and that's the safe place, and it's better to just speak to those who agree with you and have your little echo chamber so you can feel confident about what you believe, versus kind of venture out into the risky world of people might disagree. And so the great opportunity therein lies for us as Christians. As David said, we're called to be the great conversationalist. We're called to engage the other, the person that disagrees with us, the person that has a totally different view of life and meaning of life. We're to be the ones to show up in that space and offer respite from the conflict and listen and get to know one another. And so that's where I think you'll find with David and I, and our approach with this book is, sure, there's some significant challenges, but every single one of them is creating a more obvious opportunity than maybe we've had in decades to start to insert truth into real conversations by loving people and loving our neighbor by respecting them.
That sounds strangely like what Jesus did in his ministry.
Yeah.
He met with people, he asked questions, he talked about them. That's fascinating. As you're taking this message through the book and through your presentations to audiences, to Christians, are they really receptive to this idea? And do they desire to return to that kind of that conversational relationships where people are not cut off from one another?
We had a chance to, when we put this book out just under a year ago, we'd spoken a lot of churches, a lot of different pastor conferences and others. And I don't know about you, but for me, some of the most gratifying things were on Sunday mornings, speaking to churches and seeing moms and grandmothers and students and others come to us and just sort of say, these are the very issues that we're struggling with today. And a lot of times with tears in their eyes of someone saying, we finally, you're talking about the very things we're really trying to find language for. So to me, that was really wonderful. Mm-hmm. I told you my dad's a lifelong pastor, so I think there's a part of me being a researcher, I come at this with a pastor's heart. And so, being able to see God work through this work and our work together and our partnership is really humbling. And I think my observation as a researcher is that Christians are actually just really, really hungry for this kind of leadership, this kind of space where we could talk about these issues. Part of the challenge, I think, is a lot of pastors, a lot of churches, we tend to sermonize around a lot of things, and that's one very important form of rhetorical tool, the homily. It's not the only rhetorical tool that the church needs. We need Christian education. We need schools and colleges. We need to sort of Christianize the education. We need to help this next generation sort of understand how to articulate their beliefs. But to me, that's one of the great things. And could more people respond? That'd be awesome. But we're pleased to see the ways that people are responding in that way, to sort of have the tools now to go forward.
I was at a Christian university just a few months ago, and they'd given all their incoming freshmen a copy of Good Faith, this book, and that was their first assignment before they were going to start college. So you can imagine I'm thinking, man, most of them didn't read this. They just kind of skimmed through it, but you kind of had a shock because it was like their first college assignment. They're going to read this book. and they're going to be expected to write a paper on it and report on it. Well, I had the privilege of getting to meet with these students during the first week of class, and I could not believe how energized these 18-year-olds were after reading a book that was speaking to the tough issues that they felt like their youth pastor wasn't talking about, their parents didn't quite know how to engage, but it was meeting them right where they were at with their friends. And that's part of what we hope this project is doing, is helping people have language for the difficult conversations, whether it's around sexuality, life issues, and whether it's the abortion discussion or kind of end of life, race conversations in a racially charged environment in American life. We're trying to help Christians know, here's how faithful people respond to these real things, the real conversations. And we think part of the crisis right now is a lack of confidence that our faith has something to say. And when we don't see our pastors speaking to it in a way that we could relate to or know how to, a lot of the regular people in the church just start to go, oh, man, maybe we actually don't have a good answer to this challenge that the culture has posed to the Christian faith.
Wow.
And the reality is we do have incredible answers. The church has always had these answers. Most of these issues aren't brand new. They're actually quite old. The church fathers have dealt with this. The church has dealt with a lot of these things. But in a new generation, you find you're only, as we know, one generation away from the faith not being passed on.
Right.
And it just ups the ante that we have to get involved. We have to engage and double down on discipleship, Bible study and reading, prayer, and this is the idea of getting back to some of these basics
Right.
that don't maybe sound too trendy or like the newest information, and we think that's great. It's like we don't need new information. We've kind of got it all. We've always had it. We've gotten away from it, and that's probably part of the problem.
I think you'd recognize, as a person with a legal background and as a president of a Christian university, some of the headwinds. We live in California, and there are plenty of legal headwinds. So we've been talking a lot about sort of the conversational structure of our country. But let's not kid ourselves that this is a very sophisticated set of questions about how do religious organizations and religious institutions continue in a culture that views them as harmful, right? That's actually
Right.
part of the premise. And so part of what we try to take on is this notion that that Christianity and Christian institutions really matter for the development of the next generation. God doesn't need a Christian university, but he happens to use them in our current culture to great effect.
Right.
And so that's part of the other aspect of this, is the sort of the question of how do we help train and develop this next generation when there is such fundamental skepticism towards the very institutions that up until now have really sort of carried the flame forward.
Wow. What an important ministry you all are engaged in. Let me ask you a practical question. What are some practical tips that you would give a Christian when they encounter someone and they have a discussion about very different opinions, very, very distinct opinions that are very different on important matters? What does a Christian do to foster the relationship and not end things right then?
A Christian listens. I mean, the first thing we recommend is that you actually take on a virtue of being the person who's going to go the extra mile to try to understand the other person and their point of view. Because if we really value the image of God and our friends, our colleagues, the people that we're having these interactions with, we should care enough to try to understand not just what they just said to us, but hey, tell me your story. Like, how did you get there? What's your come from on this particular topic? And undoubtedly, as soon as you just ask somebody to help you understand more of where they're coming from, it starts to bring the barriers down. You start to be trusted. There's a humility to that, to say, hey, I can learn something too. I don't have the corner in the market of every piece of information. And I think that's the first step, is listening. The second would be try to accentuate any areas where you see common ground, where it's like, yeah, we actually, I agree with you that is a problem. Now, maybe we disagree on how to solve that problem, or your approach, or how the church is doing at loving people. Like, let's talk about how we can love people better, and ministry approaches, and how to be more pastoral depending on the topic you're engaging. But try to find the common ground and accentuate that, because that's what most people can work together when there's just a little kernel of something there where it's like, yeah, we agree on this, and it helps there be more connection to keep the conversation going versus walking away. Once you get to know somebody who maybe has been labeled or others have labeled for you, and you essentially are judging them by keeping that label on them, once you sort of remove that and get to know them, it's a lot harder to kind of demonize, to be divisive, to talk about them as if they're just some object that's not a real person. And so I think for Christians, the call in this moment is to demonstrate and model it. not try to tell everybody else how to do it, but to just own up to our own call to be the kinds of people who rise above and love your enemies. I mean, when Jesus says love your enemies, the vision around that wouldn't have been just ideological enemies. That was going to be people who might show up at your door and kill you or your family. A lot of us in America, it's mostly an ideological enemy. I mean, it's a Facebook enemy. It's a person that's annoying us on Twitter or something. I mean, come on, like, let's take the extra step and try to listen and seek to understand.
I'd add to that, as a researcher, that I love the role that we have because we're sort of a professional listener. We get to listen in on the stories of thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people. And so research is very limited in certain ways, but it's actually one of the very best ways to get outside of our own limited, finite perspective and listen in on others. So, one thing Christians can do is to get good information and good data and understand the world around them. But added to that, it's not just being informed. I think it's like being spiritually informed. So our pastor yesterday was just talking about Matthew and the parable of the sower. He was talking about hard-heartedness and how even we as Christians can develop hard hearts, and how God promises that he will give us a soft heart. And I would ask, as your viewers are thinking about this and just maybe even listening in, as Gabe's talking about listening and, coming with humility, that we actually have to go to God and ask him to give us that soft heart. Ezekiel 36 says, I'm gonna break up your stony heart and give you a heart of flesh. And it's so easy for us at any stage in our spiritual journey, sometimes especially when we're far along in our spiritual journey and we're very Christian, right? We feel like we've really got it mastered. And the message of Galatians is that we actually start getting off track. We actually think we know the answers to this stuff. So to be able to listen in and hear what people have to tell us, and to have a soft heart, a heart of God towards those people who might be, as Gabe was saying, really annoying us on social media. I mean, how could we actually represent Jesus to them in those moments if we're calloused in our hearts? So those would be just a few ideas.
Wow, I think I've just spent some time with two fellas, Gabe Lyons and David Kinnaman, who might be having greater impact on a continuation of conversation between Christians and others than maybe anyone else is having. Spiritual insight, that soft-heartedness, listening to others and accentuating areas where there is agreement. That will develop relationship, and relationship is so important. Gabe and David, thanks so much for being a part of OC and blessing us here, and for blessing so many folks with what you all do.
Absolutely.
God bless you.
Of course.
Thank you. Thanks.